Washington Post is reporting that the U.S. Secret Service has moved its command post out of Trump Tower in New York. Now, this comes after the federal government couldn't reach an agreement with President Trump's company over the price of the lease. CNN sources say the Secret Service is now operating out of a mobile command post on the street. David Farenthal joins me now. He reported the story for the Washington Post. So why exactly has the Secret Service vacated its Trump Tower command post? Is it they just couldn't agree on the rent inside Trump Tower?
Yeah, it sounds odd, but that's true. The president's company, which owns Trump Tower, was unable to reach an agreement with the president's government, the U.S. government, to basically they disagreed about price, they disagreed about some other conditions of the lease, and so the Secret Service left. Now the Trump organization is encouraging them to go look elsewhere in some other building.
I mean, do we know exactly what the sticking point was? I mean, do we know what the price, if it was just about price, what the difference was? Because I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that the Secret Service have to pay rent in Trump Tower to protect the president.
It is surprising. We've asked that question, both of the GSA, the government agency that handles leasing, and the Trump organization. What was the price differential? How much was the gap? And to the Trump organization, why not just offer it for free? These people are here to protect the president and his family. We didn't get responses on any of those questions from either side.
So the command post, I understand now that they've moved to, is down on the street, which means it's farther away, obviously, from the apartment. Now, the Trumps don't really stay at that apartment, I think, very much at all. But is that, from a security standpoint, is that a concern?
The Secret Service has told us that they believe that this hasn't really affected their security plan. But we talked to some security experts who had a couple of concerns with this. One was what's in this command post is the supervisors, the communications hub, and the backup agents, the people who are there to rush in a time of emergency. Now they're 50-plus floors below where the president's apartment is. So if they are needed as backup, they're a long way from getting to where they need to be. The other question is just about the communication. So now you have agents, the field agents, or the agents who are up there with the president at the president's home, many floors above, trying to communicate by radio down to people at the street. There's walls in between. There's a lot of distance in between. And there's some concern that they wouldn't be able to communicate effectively by radio.
Is this the way it's going to stay, or do they still hope to work something out?
Well, it depends on who you ask. When we asked the Secret Service, they said, yeah, we'd really like to find a way to make this work, a way to get back into Trump Tower. The Trump organization, though, has said, no, we've encouraged them for cost reasons and other reasons to go look elsewhere, basically saying, why don't you find another building? It's not the same as moving a Sbarro from one building to another. These are folks that need to be near the president. So moving to another building, even nearby, is something the Secret Service seems unwilling to do.
Wow, interesting. David Farenthal, appreciate the reporting. Thank you. Tonight, the Secret Service released a statement in response to the reporting for the Washington Post. It reads in part, the United States Secret Service continues to work with GSA to obtain permanent workspace in an appropriate location. Throughout this process, there's been no impact to the security plan developed by the Secret Service. So when we come back, the latest details on Special Counsel Robert Mueller's investigation entering a new phase, issuing subpoenas.
Anderson Cooper 360.
There's breaking news tonight on multiple fronts in the Russia White House watch. CNN has learned new details about how Special Counsel Robert Mueller and his team are following the money between the president and his associates in Russia. We'll have much more on that in a moment. We begin, though, with a new step in the investigation. Grand jury subpoenas are issued. CNN Justice correspondent Pamela Brown has the latest on that. So what have you learned about this grand jury and the subpoenas?
Well, Anderson, we've learned that the special counsel has issued grand jury subpoenas related to that Donald Trump Jr. meeting at Trump Tower of June of last year. This is according to a person that I spoke with today familiar with the matter. And these subpoenas seek both documents and testimony from people involved in the meeting. As we know, as we saw in that graphic, there were 8 people in that meeting. It's unclear exactly who the special counsel wants to testify. But given the wide-ranging investigation, it is expected that special counsel subpoenas will be or have been issued pertaining to other parts in this investigation just beyond that meeting. But Anderson, this development does tell us that Mueller takes the Trump Tower meeting seriously, and he's doing things by the book, making sure a grand jury signs off on any records requests and any testimony.
And was the grand jury just recently impaneled? Do we know the timeline?
I was told, well, we know that it was impaneled in D.C. after the special counsel was appointed, which was last May. So it had to have been the last couple of months. The subpoenas relating to that meeting at Trump Tower were issued just in the past couple of weeks. And it shows that the special counsel probe that began in May is entering really a new phase of this investigation. As we've reported, Anderson, previously before the special counsel probe, subpoenas have been issued in other aspects of this investigation, such as business associates of Michael Flynn, former national security advisor. At that time, investigators matters were used in a grand jury in Northern Virginia. But now everything is coming out of D.C., and that's where the special counsel's office is.
And that's obviously closer to where, yeah, as you said, to where Mueller's office is. What's the reaction tonight from the White House?
So the president's lawyer, Ty Cobb, reacted to this, and this is what he told reporters. He said grand jury matters are typically secret. The White House favors anything that accelerates the conclusion of his work fairly. The White House is committed to fully cooperating with Mr. Mueller. Former FBI Director James Comey said 3 times the president is not under investigation, and we have no reason to believe that has changed. And Anderson, one White House source says that the legal team is, quote, highly content about this development, which this source says is not causing any anxiety within the president's legal team. Anderson.
All right, Pamela Brown with the reporting. Thank you. With me now is Bianca Goladriga, Matt Lewis, Paul Begala, Alice Stewart, and Gloria Brown Marshall. Gloria, just from a legal standpoint, the formation of a grand jury, it allows them to do subpoenas, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they know that there is wrongdoing.
They're trying to find out if there's been wrongdoing. I mean, there are millions of dollars of resources at hand, so it's not as though they don't believe there's anything going on here, but they have to get to the actual evidence. That means they have a chance to call witnesses, to subpoena documents, and to make sure that people are testifying. And when they're testifying, they're not testifying with their lawyers in the room. They can go out in the hallway, talk to a lawyer, and come back in, but the lawyer is not in the room. It's not the testimony. It's whether or not they lie under oath. This is how people have gotten trapped before. It's perjury, it's obstruction of justice, intimidation of witnesses, all the things that the special counsel has authority to investigate.
Alice, I mean, as a supporter of the president, does it concern you? To you, does it seem like a bad sign?
I think this is what everyone expected would happen. This is a natural course of events, and I was encouraged by the president's attorney saying we will fully cooperate, we will help in any way we can, which I think is a far cry and a welcome direction from calling this a witch hunt. But I think it is important to fully cooperate, put all the information out there, because more than anything, we need to put this behind us. And I think the president has always had it in his mind. Any questions about Russia collusion, it questions whether or not he won or not, and that's certainly not the case. But it's important, as they are doing now, fully cooperating, and this is an important step. This isn't, as you indicated, not an evidence of wrongdoing, but it's part of the investigative process in order to get to the bottom of it.
So what does this do in a White House when there's this kind of investigation and a grand jury? I mean, from your experience.
It's not crippling, but close to it. And by the way, when this happened in the Clinton administration, we were in our second term. We knew what we were doing. We had a really tight team. There had been factions earlier in Clinton's presidency. At this point, there were none. We really got along. It was very tight, and thank God. This team is brand new, which my heart goes out to them. It's a hard job to learn, and riven with factionalism. And then on top of that, some of them are going to be hauled into this grand jury. I mean,
and no one knows who's being hauled in, or of course what they're saying, right?
They certainly don't know what they're saying. They're likely to know who, but they have real exposure in a way that we didn't in the Clinton White House. I didn't fool around with any of the interns, okay? I wasn't like ever going to get me, but it still stressed me out, right? And this could impact a whole lot, like those, whatever young talented aides helped craft the statement that later proved to be misleading about Donald Trump Jr.'s meeting.
Which, the White House now admits the president, they say, weighed in on. The Washington Post said dictated.
And the president's a big boy, can take care of himself, but those young people are going to get dragged in. They're going to have legal bills. They're not going to be able to talk to each other about what they said in the grand jury, lest, as Gloria pointed out, they'd be accused of either witness tampering or witness intimidation.
And they have to pay their own legal bills. This is
they do, and I had friends who had hundreds of thousands of dollars of legal bills. I'm with Alice. I like to hear the president's lawyer, Mr. Cobb, saying we're going to cooperate, and it is an expected sign, and maybe it's hopeful they get it wrapped up quickly. I don't like hearing other Trump surrogates saying this is not a big deal, or I think they're laying the predicate to fire Mueller. If you listen, when I was talking to Jason Miller in your earlier hour, he was saying they're leaking illegally, which is not true, and that they're violating the scope of their investigation by looking at financial things, which also not true. I think they're laying either they're going to go with Mr. Cobb, who's saying we're going to cooperate, or they're going to go with others who are saying, I think, laying the predicate to fire Mueller.
There were leaks, just not in this story. The big leaks were in the other story today about President Trump's private conversations with.
Yeah, which we'll talk about.
And that's problematic, and they'll try to conflate that. But I think it's part of the. This week the stock market hit a record,
22,000.
You've got tonight the governor of West Virginia switching from a Democrat to a Republican. You've got a new chief of staff. So you've got a lot of good things happening if you're Donald Trump. And if you're watching another network, maybe that's all that you're hearing. Probably it is. But on the other hand, you've got all of these other major problems. It's not a leak, it's a sieve. Right. And you've got the fact that the government has unlimited resources, unlimited time, and somebody is going to go down, I think.
Yeah, there's no telling where this goes, too.
Right.
It starts off, as we saw with Clinton, starts off with Whitewater and ends up with, the Lewinsky.
Yeah, and his attorney can say all the right things until he's blue in the face. Ultimately, it's the president who's out there in West Virginia tonight, once again calling this a witch hunt, saying it's fake news, saying that they should have been focusing on Hillary Clinton's emails. And this continues to fester for the president. This is constantly his go-to excuse. He has vilified and gone after Republicans in his own party, everyone else, the media, except for Vladimir Putin, and look at where it's gotten him. He can't learn his lesson. All that he had to do initially was say, yes, I agree with my intelligence agencies, and we're going to make sure Russia doesn't do this again. And we may not be in this situation. We may be talking instead about the stock market and infrastructure. Instead, the president seems to be shooting himself in the foot every single day.
And Anderson, I was in Little Rock as a journalist covering Whitewater when all of this was going on. So I see some similarities, and Paul's going to come unglued. But if you also have to remember, yes, that started off as a land deal investigation, and it led to Monica Lewinsky. But also going back to that time, if you recall, the Clintons and the Democrats really attacked Ken Starr and the way he handled it and called it a vast right-wing conspiracy. And we're seeing some signs of that with regard to this administration discrediting Mueller and the way the investigation is going. But I do think it's important to take more of the Cobb approach to this, and let's fully comply and let them do their job.
There is a big difference. I need to defend myself and my colleagues. When Whitewater's first had a special counsel, the counsel was appointed just like Mr. Mueller by the Attorney General, and it was a guy named Robert Fisk, a career prosecutor out of New York, a registered Republican, but a career prosecutor. We never criticized Mr. Fisk, ever, and cooperated fully. He was pursuing this, and then a three-judge panel led by a guy named David Santel, sort of a Jesse Helms protege, fired Mr. Fisk. We didn't. These Republican judges did, and then put Ken Starr in there, a man who had never prosecuted a case in his life. And we still were silent. Carville wanted to attack him. Clinton told him not to. We didn't start attacking Starr until it became obvious that he was obsessed with Bill Clinton's sex life. And that I think was fair. So if Mueller starts digging into Trump's sex life, too creepy to think about. I'll be the first to attack Mr. Mueller.
Going back to just how a grand jury works, would they, I talked to Jeff Toobin in the last hour, who said they probably already have, and they would want to have a certain amount of documentation before they actually interview people, before they hold people in front of the grand jury, because they don't want to, it's not like in front of the Senate where they're just kind of asking random questions. They want evidence that they can specifically tailor their questions to the
Yes, but they also want to substantiate what they already have. So they could call people in as witnesses, they can call people in as targets. You don't know which one you're going to be for the most part. They basically don't tell you, but you have an idea. If they're calling in the brother-in-law, then you pretty much know that's a target. But here's the issue at hand. It's once they get into that room and they start to testify, there's going to be a thread. And if you go back even to Vince Foster and the suicide, there was that thread of they're investigating in the Clinton years, the suicide, which then leads a thread into Whitewater, leads a thread into all these, and you know, of course, better than I do, but each time someone testified, there was a thread leading into another bigger part of the investigation. And when you look at what Bob Mueller is able to do, and it says, and matters, and all matters, that stem from this investigation. So despite what Donald Trump is saying, there is no red line that says that Bob Mueller has to stop at any particular place.
Right, his attorney is saying that they're basically exceeding their mandate. You're saying the mandate is actually pretty broad.
It's pretty broad, and it was pretty broad in the Nixon years. It was pretty broad in the Clinton years. It's very broad. And once they start to see something, especially a prosecutor. Now, here we have an assistant attorney general, as well as the former head of the FBI, looking at this, the antenna come up, and they go, okay, wait a minute. I just heard this person testify about this. I'm going to further and broaden my investigation, follow the money wherever it leads me. And you don't know where this money may lead.
That gets us to our next segment. We got to take a quick break. More breaking news. CNN has learned the Mueller investigation is crossing the president's so-called red line following the Trump money trail for potential ties to Russia that may have existed long before the election, had nothing to do with the election. Also tonight, the leaked transcripts of the president's phone calls that Matt talked about with the leaders of Mexico and Australia. He claimed one of the calls was not contentious, called it fake news, attacked the Washington Post for reporting it. Now we know for sure that's not true. We're keeping them. There's more breaking news tonight in the Russia investigation. CNN has learned how Special Counsel Robert Mueller and his team are on the money trail, reviewing financial records tied to the president, the Trump Organization, and his family, according to sources familiar with the investigation. Pamela Brown is one of the CNN reporters who broke this story. She joins us again. So what have you learned?
Well, we've learned several things, Anderson, that the special counsel probe has expanded to look at President Trump's finances, as well as the finances of his family members, his son, Don Jr., and even the Trump Organization. As you know, Anderson, this all started off as a look into whether there was collusion with the Russians, and that probe has now expanded a year in to really focus on the financial avenue. As sources have told us, prosecutors, investigators look at that to be one of the most fertile avenues to go down if there is going to be prosecution. And two of main targets here are Paul Manafort, who was the former campaign chairman, of course, and as well as Michael Flynn, the former national security advisor. Anderson.
You know, this was something that President Trump in an interview recently with the New York Times had said was sort of a red line in answer to a question of theirs about, you know, his kind of past financial records. What's the White House response been to this?
Well, the White House response has been very stern. In fact, I spoke to Jay Sekulow, the attorney for the president, who says that this is basically outside the scope of what they believe, outside of what Mueller should be doing. He said president's outside counsel has not received any requests for documentation or information about this in terms of asking for financial records. He went on to say any inquiry from the special counsel that goes beyond the mandate specified in the appointment, we would object to. So making it clear there and echoing what we heard from the president that in their view this does cross the red line. I should point out too that any lead that comes into the Department of Justice that has to do with any of Trump's associates, including Paul Manafort, Michael Flynn, is directed to the special counsel probe. So even if it has nothing to do with Russia or the 2016 election, it will go to Robert Mueller, and there's a couple reasons for that. Obviously, they want to investigate every lead they can, but also it could be used as a tool to gain leverage in order to encourage cooperation among some of the subjects. Anderson.
Pamela Brown, thanks very much. Actually, stay with us. Going to bring back the panel back in. Also joining the conversation is Trump biographer Timothy O'Brien. Timothy, I mean, you looked into Donald Trump's finances for years, intimately, got sued for it by him. There's an irony here that this is sort of the one realm, or this is a major realm that he has always refused to discuss, refused to go into, refused to release his tax returns, and this now seems to be an avenue that the investigators are looking into.
Yeah, and I think the president can talk about red lines and witch hunts, but Mueller's well within his rights to probe these issues. It goes to the heart, I think, of any quid pro quos that existed between the Trump Organization and the Kremlin, the Trump campaign in the Kremlin, the Trump White House in the Kremlin. These are issues that have to get explored. And I think the reason he's so focused on this on almost a daily basis for months now is because he's concerned about what it might expose. And he's got past relationships in his business relationship with the Trump Organization and relationships that I think came to the fore during the election that are very problematic for him.
So to those, I mean, who's the Trump supporters who say, look, this goes beyond the scope of what, why is Mueller looking at, financial transactions that may have occurred long before Donald Trump was even a candidate?
Well, I was going to say, I think, look, if there's some sort of a quid pro quo with Russia, then obviously I think that is relevant. But it's probably just as likely that you might stumble across some sort of financial irregularities that have nothing to do with Russia. And then what do you do? And I tell you, I think the American public, and not just Trump supporters, but a lot of people, it would start to feel like the deep state, like the game is rigged, like this is somebody trying to overturn the election. So, that's where I think it gets kind of messy.
But what should they do? First off, it is within the scope. The scope is broad, and that was set by the Trump Justice Department, by a man Trump picked to be the Deputy Attorney General, Rod Rosenstein. He set the parameters of this investigation. So in a sense, Mr. Trump is
responsible. But remember, with Bill Clinton, the public stuck with Bill Clinton,
yes,
and they liked him.
And they're not sticking with Mr. Trump. And that's a really interesting and important problem, because part of this for him is political. Should it ever get to impeachment, that's a political
But if prosecutors do stumble across some, we don't know that there is, but some financial irregularity that has nothing to do with Russia even, or with the election, would they pursue it? I mean, from a legal standpoint, Gloria, would they?
Well, it really depends on what it is. What happened with the Nixon years is that as they were investigating Nixon, they found all these other irregularities. And, of course, obstruction of justice. Conspiracy to obstruct justice is what was actually the charge. But the executive privilege issue was the issue that stopped them cold. So this issue of whether or not they could go after a sitting president for any other criminal reason was never decided. It was left in abeyance because they already had the what they wanted, which was the tape.
Here's what's likely to happen. The special counsel, let's say he comes across information that Trump was complicit in the Kennedy assassination. Apparently that was Ted Cruz's father, right? Something, I'm trying to pick something crazy that I don't want to impugn the guy. Okay? The special counsel knows this is outside of his mandate, so he goes to the Deputy Attorney General and says, you need to put the U.S. Attorney or Justice Department on this Kennedy assassination problem. The Deputy Attorney General can then expand to include the expand the Mueller probe to include the JFK assassination, or he can turn it over to a U.S. Attorney or DOJ. You can't just ignore a crime if you're a federal law enforcement officer.
Yeah. I just want to reiterate for anyone who happened to join mid-sentence, you were not into outlaws. You were using that as a ridiculous absurd.
But can you indict a sitting president for whatever it may be? That is the issue that's still open because it wasn't decided in the Nixon years. So that is a major issue. So whether or not they find the smoking gun with anything, whatever it may be, can we indict a sitting president? So far, that's unanswered. The Supreme Court hasn't gone that far.
I think it's important, and we've all agree on this point, the mandate is broad, and it deals with all matters that arose or may arise. And I think as the more the story changes, Jay Sekulow says, oh, it didn't help with drafting the statement, and the way the story changes, that just gives another stone for Mueller to overturn. And the question is, will he get his hands on those income tax returns? That will be a big...
I'm sure he already has his hands on the income tax return.
But I do want to say this. I think you say the public's against Donald Trump. His base is standing firm. The rally tonight, he brought up this topic. Russia did not elect me. You people, my voters and my team did. His base is standing firm, and they're standing behind him.
But that's not the public. That's about a quarter of the public, and they're wonderful people, and we love them. But they're not analytically as interesting because they're not going to determine the president's ultimate success
and it's not the legal system as well. The reason why Russia is of interest is because there's a real gray area between the private and public sector in Russia. You have billionaires in Russia that are constantly and forever tied to the Russian government, as the Agalarovs are too. So this isn't just your typical billionaire from any other country that comes in and maybe has some shady dealings with Donald Trump. This, as we know now from the paper trail, connects to the Russian government.
It is interesting that he continues to, go. Today he went after Congress. Not Russia, for the low in what he characterizes, the lowest Russian relations in I think he said in I don't know, years. I can't remember the time frame.
Yeah, that was one of his tweets today was that it's the GOP Congress that's why the relations are bad, when in fact we have bad relations with Russia because they interfered with our election and possibly influenced
Which is exactly what Russia is trying to seize upon. They're in a bad place and they're trying to make the best of it. And what they're doing right now is trying to distance this president from Congress and try to drive a wedge and chaos between not only the president and Democrats, but now we know the president and people within his own party.
And Pamela, the president may not like that Mueller's digging into his finances, but there's not much he can do about it short of a seismic reshuffling of the Justice Department.
Right. So basically, he could ask Rod Rosenstein, the Deputy Attorney General, to fire Robert Mueller, which, just bottom line, will not happen unless there is cause, unless Rod Rosenstein thinks that there is a good reason. He's come out, he's testified on Capitol Hill saying he sees no reason to fire the man that he's appointed to take on this role as a special counsel. And I've been told by people in Department of Justice and elsewhere in the legal community here in Washington that if the president asks Rod Rosenstein to do so, then he just simply wouldn't and would likely leave the department. And so, of course, there could be some moving parts. Who knows? We know that the president has been threatening the attorney general. Barring a seismic shift, as you said, it's likely that Rod Rosenstein will not be firing Robert Mueller anytime soon, Anderson.
All right, everybody, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, what President Trump said tonight about the Russia investigation and how the West Virginia crowd reacted. We'll be right back. Tonight, President Trump spoke at a rally in West Virginia where he went on a long riff about Russian influence in the election, or the lack of it, and the investigation into potential collusion with his campaign. Here's part of what he said.
Have you seen any Russians in West Virginia or Ohio or Pennsylvania? Are there any Russians here tonight? Any Russians? They can't beat us at the voting booths. So they're trying to cheat you out of the future and the future that you want. They're trying to cheat you out of the leadership you want with a fake story that is demeaning to all of us, and most importantly, demeaning to our country and demeaning to our Constitution.
Back now with the panel. You were saying, Gloria, before that that people don't necessarily know if they are the target of a grand jury. The president's attorney said we have no reason to believe that the president is being investigated, and they pointed to the fact that Comey had told the president 3 times that he wasn't targeting the investigation. It's possible that has changed in the subsequent weeks and months. Is it possible that the president would actually be called to testify whether or not he was a target in a grand jury?
Well, the president could be called to testify. I mean, Bill Clinton was called to testify. But what we also have to understand is this is going to go on for years. The possibility that can go on for years. So Trump might not be the target now, but we don't know who's going to testify about what. But also conspiracy to obstruct justice, conspiracy in regards to witness intimidation. So that could come further down the line when other people are called to testify, and maybe Donald Trump, tells them not to, or threatens them in some way, or somebody around him. I mean, it could go in many different directions.
It is interesting with just the cast of characters that the president has had around him who are no longer there, and sort of the competing, motives, and the fact that many times the thing the White House has said or the president has said does not hold up to the light of day when it's actually leaked and then reported, and then they have to amend their statement.
And when you go to a grand jury, that matters. It matters when you say it to the American people, but it matters more at a grand jury. That is a sacred place, and you cannot lie or mislead there. And I think the president is so telling. We always know what's on his mind. He again tonight is pretending that Russia didn't play a role in the election. It doesn't mean that he did, but Russia did. And his own intelligence agencies say that. And again tonight, he's casting doubt on that.
It's fascinating.
It's a huge problem.
It's as if he's watching RT before he goes out, because his message is the exact same Russian TV. His message is exactly what's being played out in Russia, that there's Russophobia going on in the States. When he says there are any Russians in West Virginia, we know what you're talking about. His campaign lied about meeting Russians. Exactly.
But Tim, you've actually, correct me if I'm wrong, in the lawsuit you had with Donald Trump, he actually, your side deposed him.
Right, we deposed him for 2 days.
And can you say how he did under?
He did horribly. It's a public document. Actually, the Washington Post did a front page story about the deposition. I think the headline was that time that Donald Trump acknowledged lying 30 times in 2 days.
Under oath, he acknowledged.
Under oath, he had to, because we had his tax returns, we had his bank records, we had business records. We asked him about everything from his net worth to the resale value of his apartments, and on and on and on. His speaking fees. He lied about everything. And it was really funny. At one point, we asked him how he calculated the value of his golf courses, because he didn't have any sort of records in front of him. And he said mental projections. That was the term he used. And I sort of think his life has been a series of mental projections. It's one of the reasons he's a survivor. He creates his own realities. And I think you're seeing now in the speech in Virginia, he's very scared of the Russian investigation. It preoccupies him. And so he's using another public appearance to cast doubt on it. And he's creating this other reality around it so he can move forward. But the reality of it is, it's not just going to ensnare him potentially. It could ensnare Jared Kushner. It could ensnare other members of his family, Don Jr., and there's a lot at risk here for him.
And he, talk about mental projection, he truly believes what he said out there tonight. He truly believes any question about Russia is undermining his victory, and that's truly what he believes, and those around him believe. And he went on tonight at this event to say that the Russia probe that is distracting the administration is total fabrication. So here again, he's gone back to the total fabrication witch hunt, which I think he should get back in line. I think he should, as with his attorneys doing, we're going to fully comply. We'll provide all the information we can. That is the quickest way to get this in the rearview mirror and move on to the issues that Americans really care about.
The other big story today, leaked transcripts of phone calls between the president and the leaders of Mexico and Australia. It's extraordinary that these transcripts actually leaked out. You get another example in one case of the president of the United States falsely attacking reporters for telling the truth about one of the phone calls, what he said then, and what the reality is. We're keeping them on us next.
Seeing the 1990s and looking at major pivot points, Columbine, the shooting in schools, the bombing in Oklahoma City.
For less than 24 hours, we've gone from the White House admitting that 2 phone calls the president said he actually didn't get, to transcripts from 2 calls that did happen being leaked, and neither paints a very flattering picture of the president. The Washington Post published transcripts from 2 calls the president had early on in his presidency with Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto and Australian Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull. We're going to start with the Mexico call. The president argued about Mexico paying for the wall, not on plan or principle, but because it would make him look bad. Quote, he said this to the Mexican president: "The only thing I will ask you, though, is on the wall, you and I both have a political problem. My people stand up and say Mexico will pay for the wall, and your people probably say something in a similar but slightly different language. But the fact is, we're both in a little bit of a political bind because I have to have Mexico pay for the wall. I have to." And why, of course, does he have to? Because he promised he would over and over and over. It was a mantra of the campaign, a claim shouted call and response style to crowds all across this country for months.
We will build the wall 100%. I promise we will build the wall. And who's going to pay for the wall? Who's going to pay for the wall? Who? It'll be a great wall. Mexico's going to pay for the wall. Mexico is going to pay for the wall. Mexico will pay for the wall. And Mexico's going to pay for the wall, and they understand that. Mexico is going to pay for the wall, believe me, 100%.
Well, in the call with the Mexican president, Mr. Trump asked him to stop saying Mexico will never pay for the wall. Mr. Trump says they should both just say that, quote, "we are working it out." Keeping them honest, what is interesting is that Mexico has never actually wavered in saying they won't pay for the wall, but President Trump has wavered, not just in this phone call, but to American taxpayers. His plan now is that taxpayers will pay for the wall and Mexico will somehow pay us all back. As he said to Mexico's president in the call, the funding, quote, "will work out in the formula somehow. It'll come out in the wash." Meaning, it seems he wants Mexico to officially pay for the wall, but they will get the money back through other means. What's so interesting about this call is how concerned President Trump was about how this makes him look. The Mexican president says, quote, "my position has been and will continue to be very firm, saying that Mexico cannot pay for that wall." The president responds, "but you cannot say that to the press. The press is going to go with that, and I cannot live with that." The president also expresses concern about how he appears in his leaked phone call with Australia's prime minister. The president argues to the prime minister about an Obama administration deal for the United States to accept up to 2,000 refugees subject to vetting. The president says, quote, "this is going to kill me. I'm the world's greatest person that does not want to let people into the country." The president says it makes him look bad and he hates it. Quote, "look, I spoke to Putin, Merkel, Abe of Japan, and France today, and this was my most unpleasant call because I will be honest with you, I hate taking these people. I guarantee you they are bad. That is why they are in prison right now. They are not going to be wonderful people who go on to work for the local milk people." The local milk people being, we assume, dairy farmers. I'm just assuming. On the call, the prime minister tries to explain the refugees are mostly economic refugees from Iran, Pakistan, and Afghanistan and have been under Australian supervision for more than 3 years, and that there was a deal between the United States and Australia. The president says the prime minister made a stupid deal. What's so interesting about the transcript is that there were reports published at the time that this call was contentious. And guess what? At the time, the president tweeted, quote, "thank you, Prime Minister of Australia, for telling the truth about our very civil conversation that fake news media lied about. Very nice." Once again, something the president called fake news turned out to be very real. Very nice. Back now at the panel. How big of a problem, Alice, do you think it is for the president that in just this week, he made up 2 phone calls or made a mistake about 2 phone calls that he never received from the Boy Scouts, and what was the other one? I can't even remember.
From Mexico.
From the president of Mexico?
Yeah, from the president of Mexico. That's right, yes. And now he's, made it up about, fake news, lying, going after reporters in a way that's just not true.
He has a distorted memory or recollection of events, which is unfortunate. The problem with these calls, I view them as, is that these calls when he first, took office and became president. These were to test his negotiating skills with his foreign counterparts. And first off, with regard to Australia, this is an ally, and he was having a confrontational phone call. With regard to the president of Mexico, this should have been a call about policy. He was more concerned with his perception with breaking a campaign promise, and that's unfortunate. Both of these, he was more concerned about his perception than discussing serious policy with these foreign counterparts, and I think that is unfortunate.
I think the big story here, and I know that he's cynical, he cares more about appearances, he attacks the media for fake news when it's actually true. And I know Trump people come on here all day long, and all they want to do is say they want to misdirect. They want to change the subject. They want to talk about the leaks. In this case, the leaks is the big story. It is incredibly dangerous that the President of the United States cannot have a private conversation with the leader of another country without somebody in the government, presumably, leaking that out. It sends a message to leaders of other countries. And that's incredibly damaging. And
what leader of another country is going to feel confident having a private phone call or a frank phone call with the president? And why would the president feel comfortable having a frank phone call with another leader if they all think it's going to leak out?
It's enormously damaging. As a former White House official, it's terribly damaging to our country. Not just to Donald Trump politically, who I don't support, but to our country for this to leak. It's a terrible breach. These calls are on the record, and the other head of state knows that. But in that, we have note takers, we have transcribers, the president knows that, everybody knows it. It's a very on-the-record event, because then that record is shared throughout the government. So we talked about trade with the Mexican president, the U.S., presumably, right, the U.S. trade representative needs to know about that, so that when he's negotiating with his Mexican counterpart, she says, your president promised X, they'll know. It goes to the State Department, Defense Department, Homeland Security, perhaps in the case of the Mexicans. Has to go all around, CIA, all around the government. And these happen all the time, and they never leak, because those are people of great integrity. Somebody really betrayed his or her country with this. I don't like when it shows about
I think
Trump,
there are occasions.
I do think you're right, Matt. This is more important.
But look, I think there are occasions when civil disobedience would be called for, right? There could be something going on where I think somebody...
Say the call with Putin.
Right. So sometimes you're a whistleblower, sometimes you're a leaker, right? But this is not that occasion. Look, this is embarrassing to Trump. It shows that he's very cynical. But I don't think this does great damage to America. And this isn't the most important component, but one of the things it does, we're just showing what's happening in West Virginia.
Right, it plays into the media. It plays into the message that he is saying to his base, which is
the game is rigged.
Right, the deep state is against me.
They're out to get me.
Well, that's very damaging to America's democracy.
They're not just out to get me; they're out to get you and deny.
I don't think that's the most important story, but it's part of the story.
He is in charge of the government. He does need to police and inspire and intimidate. He needs to stop this. And so this does say something about Trump. Ultimately, it says more about the leaker. But it is the president's job. He's in command of this government.
And they've had these problems from the beginning with leaks. It's he has a poorly managed West Wing.
Right.
There's very little loyalty. He is not skilled or capable.
But he's also is this a precedent, though? Right. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say not to excuse it, because you're absolutely right. But the president has sort of over the past few months been leading us down a different path, saying that no, all of these conversations didn't happen the way the media is reporting that they did, and they actually did happen the way they did. So, my advice to him would be to stop lying or to stop tweeting about things that didn't happen. That doesn't negate the point you're trying to make as well, because this is very damaging.
My concern would be that I think everyone here is right. I think, obviously Donald Trump has been kind of uniquely bad in a lot of ways, and it very well could be that he is lost the faith and trust of people who work for him, and that they were good soldiers, they were lifetime bureaucrats, they did what they were told, and now they feel like it's their responsibility to leak. But does this set a precedent? What about the next president?
A drug-infested den. Just for accuracy's sake, the president did not win that state in the general election. Obviously, I guess he won in the primary, but I assume that's what he was talking about. He's facing criticism for his description of the Granite State. Among his critics, former New Hampshire governor and current Senator Maggie Hassan. We spoke earlier.
Well, I was outraged, and it's just disgusting. We are in the middle of public health and public safety challenge and crisis in our state. It's an epidemic, and to hear the President of the United States characterize people with chronic illness and our state this way was just an outrage. And so I am urging the president to stop just talking about this issue and actually help us deal with it by helping us get the resources we need to get people into treatment, to get the kind of workforce we need to help people get treated, and then understand that this is a chronic illness that will require prevention, treatment, and recovery efforts for the long term. And one of the other concerns I have is that it isn't just that the president hasn't taken action to actually help us with this issue, and it's not just New Hampshire, obviously, it's across the country, but it's also that his actions since becoming president in advocating for the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, for instance, which would repeal our bipartisan Medicaid expansion program, so critical to treatment in New Hampshire, and his budget, which defunds programs that are also really important for prevention, treatment, and recovery, really are undermining our efforts in New Hampshire. So I just would like the president to stop throwing insults at people dealing with a chronic illness and really help us get the resources on the ground that we need.
Back now with the panel. Obviously, calling New Hampshire drug-infested den is not the best use of term, but, you know, for the president's supporters, a lot of people like the fact that he's plain-spoken and you know, that will, I mean, is this really a big deal?
But the opioid crisis actually hits, if you think about it on a map, Trump country harder perhaps than Obama country or Hillary country. And it's not a partisan disease, but just the way it hits.
And he did talk about it when he was in New Hampshire. He talked about it during the campaign. Not in those terms, about it being a...
I was struck watching the campaign. Every one of those 30 people who ran learned a lot about the opioid crisis. Some of the good things about having a long and difficult campaign. So, but I think that will hurt him, frankly, in New Hampshire, where there's the Republican governor, Chris Sununu, also said today that was uncalled for. But he also said something else to President Pena. He described the wall as, quote, the least important thing we're talking about. That is not what his voters said.
No, he said it was payment of the wall.
Was the
you go back and
they cheered? I thank you for correcting me, but still they cheered that. That makes
he said politically, it's probably maybe the most important, but it's the least important.
But you know what? I'll say the Washington Post. They put up little teasers of of things, and the teaser they said the wall is not the most important. But my interpretation, when you read the transcript, what he was just saying is, look, who pays for it is not that important. I'm going to build the wall, but who pays?
That's not what his supporters think. That's what he told his supporters.
The reality is, the wall was this metaphor for what he was going to do about immigration, how he was going to tackle immigration, and ultimately wall off Mexico in the process. And in that call, he's backing off from it. Whether it's financing the wall or building it, he was backing off.
By the way, so interesting that Joshua Green reported in his book about Steve Bannon